When I was studying at the university, I studied sociology. I used to have a teacher who told us, please, young chaps, you have to study a lot because otherwise you are going to end up writing journalism. So for him, journalism was the last stage of humankind. And I remember this daily whenever I write for the press. But at those days, the press was strongly controlled by the government. There was no freedom of the press. Now things have changed, but in a very contradictory way, because you have more freedom of the press, but the things you have to cover are much more terrible than the ones that used to cover journalists some 30 years ago. Many journalists, among them Sergio González Rodríguez, are under menace. According to Journalists Without Borders, Mexico is the most dangerous country to practice journalism with Iraq. So it has become a peril to work in this business. And I write about politics and all the problems we have in our society, trying to understand this complicated situation. No, there's a novel by Roberto Bolaños called The Savage Detectives, and the first chapter of this novel is called Mexicans Lost in Mexico. So, and that's how we feel a lot of times. We feel lost in our own country. And well, I write nonfiction trying to get out of this labyrinth and try to make sense of a reality that doesn't seem to have a real sense.
No, and it has been a labor of everyday compromise and engaging with something you have to tell to the people. And you have done it really, really well. It's very important, Juan voice and Sergio voices. People read them every day to find out what is happening and to think about what is happening, how to analyze, assimilate, understand all this violence. And that's why there is this word that we used yesterday also, the word mercy, misericordia, to write about this with mercy and trying to understand both sides, what is happening. And in that sense, Sergio has been risking his life writing about these things. And maybe, Sergio, you can tell us a little bit how you start to just this.
Yes, thank you, Gabriel. Thank you for coming at this meeting. I think the word mercy is a very important word, at least for me, because behind the word mercy, it's a sort of comprehension in general about war. And you know, maybe you remember, comprehension is having love, or try to have in love. Comprehension is have to try and love, and this thinking is something real, something good, something necessary in our lives. Mercy is comprehension. Comprehension in relation to the other people in another country, for example. Comprehension is to understand why a great country as Mexico is having a bad time now because of the crime and the violence, but it's a great country with culture, history, memory, language, arts, literature. And this is the most important, to try to have a comprehension about our time, our past, and the time and past of the other people. I remember a long time ago, I was reading about a Scottish writer that in that time, I mean in the 20s of the 20th century, Wilfred Edward, this Scottish writer, went to Mexico to have a good time. And unfortunately, they was killed in Mexico City. Wilfred Edward was at the window, and in this moment, in that moment, exactly, a gun is fired and shot Wilfred Edward. A great writer. Remember, please, his name, Wilfred Edward, a Scottish member of Scottish War, a great soldier and a great writer. He died in Mexico City in 1921. This strange episode, I think, is necessary to have a comprehension about. The violence is terrible in general, but the violence is the point, the matter, to think about what are our body, our past, our memory is very important. For example, how became in this situation in my country is for me a problem for thinking, an intellectual problem. How to form this bad time in literature. How try to find the way to express this dramatic situation with the high values of literature. In my life as a journalist, I was attacked and I was kidnapped. It's very terrible because I only was trying to inform people about the bad situation in the border of Mexico and United States. The problem of the violence against women, for example. A lot of women was murdered in the border, and now in whole Mexico it's a lot of violence against women. But even though this situation in my job, I think I'm very fortunate to live, for example. But many of my brothers in the journalists, they didn't have the same situation. So, in the memory of our brothers in the job of the journalist, I beg you an applause, please. I think the best homage for this situation, for this brotherhood, is to have better our job at the day and another day. I mean, it's more important to get some writing. I mean, for the most values in the memory of the dead in Mexico, and the memory of the people in the future, in general, in the world. I think my job is try to do my job better all the day, better each.
It's very, Sergio, yes, that job, I have here some titles of your work that are quite amazing. I will read it in Spanish, maybe Juana can translate it. Los bajos fondos.
The low depths.
Campo de guerra.
War zone.
Huesos en el desierto.
Bones in the desert.
La máquina feminicida.
The
Feminicide?
feminicide machine.
You are a kind of a war correspondent, Sergio. I think you are doing the chronicle of all these fields of war in Mexico, campos de guerra en general en México.
Campo. Yes, I think Mexico is now a territory of war because the war against the drugs, I think, is terrible because the idea is the politics is to go against the drugs, but it's not necessary. I think the people have to choose.
Journalism also, not just literature, journalism in Mexico has been so important, so close to all the people, but also the institutions, close to power. I know it's everywhere the same, but in Mexico it's especially perverse, all the connections, all the things you have to do. You Juan, I know, yeah, it's mentioned, it's interesting, you mentioned how journalism was not like high literature, but you have made it. Both of you have made journalism a high literary genre in Mexico. I think that is something that really became popular culture. In a country that there are not many readers in general, but you have done an amazing job in connecting and informing people, but also with high degree and level. So how, even talking about soccer, talking about the everyday things of the game of life.
Yes, well, I think in the great moments, journalism is literature under pressure. No? And you can read the Daniel Defoe journey of the Plague Year, no, as well as Robinson Crusoe. So, and for example, Gabriel Garcia Marquez was a great nonfiction writer and a great novelist as well. No, it's not always the case, but you can achieve it. No, and Sergio was addressing a very interesting issue, and you were mentioning it as well, Gabriel. And it has to do with being a war correspondent. Some 20 years ago, I wrote a short story in which the main character wanted to be a war correspondent just to have a chance to go abroad. No, it was a way of knowing places all over the world. But the paradox is that now you can be a war correspondent in your own country because writing journalism belongs to that. And I was talking about this national state of Veracruz, where I read for the first time Robert Louis Stevenson. I was there on holidays with my family because my uncle used to live there. And now in the national state of Veracruz, in the last 4 years, there has been in office Javier Duarte from the ruling party in Mexico, the PRI, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional. So during his 4 years in office, 15 journalists have been killed, and none of the suspect has been is in jail, has been presented to justice. So this is terrible, the impunity in which such a man as Javier Duarte can rule, and to cover his deeds and to enhance his image, he was paying $1 million a year to the Hay Festival in Veracruz. So it was a contradiction in terms. Here you have a festival in which people are discussing freedom of speech, and at the same time, Mexican journalists are being assassinated. Of course, there was a turmoil, there was a protest among civil rights militants and so on, and the festival was canceled, but it lasted some 3 years there in Veracruz. So we live in these contradictions. I don't know, maybe you remember the film The Third Man with Orson Welles. It has a film script by Graham Greene. And there's a scene in which Orson Welles tells another character, he says, well, do you know what has achieved the peace and the stability of Switzerland? It has achieved an extraordinary country, and the most interesting outcome of this country is the cuckoo watch. On the other hand, you have the violence, you have the corruption, you have the wars of Italy, and the outcome is the Renaissance. So sometimes this violent society fosters a reaction of creativity. I think that's the case of Mexico, as very aptly was telling us Sergio. And we are not only aware of the situation, but we are trying to react in a creative way. You were talking about mercy, and I think that's a key word, because whenever you find out that there are crimes and there is violence and you have corruption and an unfair society, at the same time you think you realize that the most radical act against all these things is to create something. I mean, now there is nothing more radical in Mexico than writing about love, about mercy, about sensuality. Because exactly in the midst of this inferno, trying to imagine a paradise, it's very, very important. So it's the same when I think that the best redemption of spring was made by a Russian composer. If you know the Russian winter, you can cherish the spring as nobody else. So if you know the Mexican inferno, you can dream of a better paradise as nobody else can.
Yes, absolutely. Also because, as we were talking before with Sergio, especially the spectacle, violence as a spectacle has become an industry also, and obviously that very dangerous one. And there is this kind of industry. And you were talking about, but what is behind this industry of violence? No, the spectacularity of violence we live. So how you handle that? No.
Well, I think I think the task, I mean the word task, to have a relation with violence, because this is the occasion to think, to have a reflection, not to establish convocation about morbosity or whatever, but to think why the violence, how became at this situation. It's necessary to think in violence to permit the violent images to put in front of us, because this is the possibility of think about this risk, not a spectacular situation, not about appreciation on the violence and the people. No. It's necessary to think about the violence for improve our human condition.
Also, I think in the context of Mexican history, literature, has been something that has been going on for the whole 20th century and what is now on the 21st. We were talking yesterday how literature, one very important part of Mexican literature starts with the Mexican Revolution, which was very violent. And there are so many amazing writing from that time, and that generated a kind of genre that was happening during the whole century. It became a kind of underground writing, close to the countryside, talking about the stories of the campesinos and the lower classes, of the people who fought in the revolution, and then at the end, kind of lost. But then, during the whole century, Mexico has been building up its modernity, its institutions, and then the crisis became evident at the end of the 20th century. And then this type of writing that started at the beginning of the 20th century keeps being so important. This is still kind of war correspondent. It's still an activity, and it's one of the most important parts of Mexican literature. And I think that has been quite something. I mean, that will be a book to one day translate the whole war correspondence during the 100 years.
Yes. Yes, when you talk about violence in Mexico, it's impossible not to speak about the United States, because that's one of our main problems. You remember that we had a dictator, Porfirio Diaz, who stayed in power some 30 years, and he used to say, "Poor Mexico, so far away from God, so close to the United States." So that's our situation. We share with the United States the biggest border between the first world and the so-called third world. This is the border with more crossings all over the world, but many of these crossings are illegal ones. So we share border with the biggest consumer of drugs in the world and the biggest arms sellers in the world. So this is very important to understand the Mexican situation with narcs and the so-called war on drugs.
And in Mexico, arms are forbidden. It's interesting.
Exactly. Arms are forbidden. Everybody has an arm, as many forbidden things.
But they were coming from the U.S.
Exactly.
In theory, they are illegal.
It's 2,000 arms daily are smuggled from the United States to Mexico, and 200 ones are recovered daily. So daily they come 2,000 and 200 ones are recovered. So this statistic tells you about the forbidden arms going on all over Mexico. No? There's a huge circulation of arms. So that's one issue where we have to address, and it's a very interesting situation, the perception of the menace of drugs in the United States. The DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, is responsible for fighting drugs. So, but you know that for Americans it's very, very important to have an enemy and who is a foreigner. It can be at a certain time of the world a Nazi, a communist, a terrorist, an Islamic terrorist, or a drug dealer nowadays. So the enemy is outside, and they think that, well, they are not involved with the problem. But nobody knows a thing about the enemy within the United States. We know the names and the nicknames of all the drug lords in Mexico, Colombia, and all over the world. We know the stories. We know the narratives. But there's no narrative inside the United States of what is happening. There are hints about this. If you see series like The Sopranos or The Wire, there is somebody in internal affairs fighting corruption inside the police department and so on. But there are no real stories. We don't know what's going on in the States, and it's only natural that there are mafias working in the States since they are the biggest drug consumers in the world. But we are the ones who have not only the dead bodies, but we are the ones who have the narratives. So we are the guilty ones, the ones who are outside the United States and who allegedly are a menace to the United States. So even if you read novels in the States like The Power of the Dog, for example, by Don Winslow, a very good writer, he used to work for the DEA. So he has a lot of information. And if you read this, there are also hints about corruption inside the United States, but all the narratives, all the guilty guys are in Mexico. Because that's the thing that is known. The latest book by Saviano, 000, is exactly the same. So he tries to investigate inside the United States, and he gets some clues, but nothing more. And in Mexico, everything is spoken about. And so I think we have to fight against this in the sense that it's not only a Mexican problem, it's a global problem, and it has to do with sharing this border with the United States.
Maybe we should send you as war correspondents to the U.S. and do your research over there.
No, I will end up living with Salman Rushdie in a hidden place. Being his roommate.
That's right.
I think if, since the point of view of United States, the present is a big film, a big movie, and in this big film or movie, the Mexicans are the bad and the ugly guy at the same time.
It's quite interesting also that in Mexico we have, and in Latin America we have this narrative about all this underworld and crime and violence, and then becomes a kind of surrealism. We were also talking about surrealism as a kind of, but quite amazingly, there is no translation of this that much into English, right? Mm-hmm. So how you have 5 books talking about this violence, these facts, this happening that is connected with the American reality, with the market over there, and there is no translation of that work to the American people. This is very interesting. So at the end, you have their own writers, I guess, writing about this. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I mean, you know, it's quite interesting that because the translation of the problem.
The translation is very important. I have only one book translated to English language. The title is The Femicide Machine. The Femicide Machine is about, it's on the violence against women in the border of Mexico and the United States, but was published in an independent enterprise, an independent editor. And it's very difficult to convince to American editors to publish one like author or a writer, Mexican writer. I think it's this asymmetry between both nations. I mean, the United States think Mexico is only territory to exploit. For example, resources, natural resources, or the low salary in the world, in the assemblage industry, for example, las maquiladoras. Mm-hmm. But they don't think in Mexico as a country with his own memory and language and history. They think as a part of his big plan of control and vigilance and surveillance in general.
And now it's interesting also that now how things have changed also, and we were talking about the 90s, the internet communication, and how this world that they want to build and the border is something that people are crossing anyway, and we are crossing it in and out. And there are many writers living in New York and in the U.S. and coming back. The communication has also increased so much, and that has been quite interesting, I think. And how would you take, I mean, for example, we're talking about this contemporary Mexican literature, how has become so rich in all the different new writers we are having and all the work you have done now, and then you see the youngers writing about so many different things, and in the north, in the border, and in the south, the poetry, and in the center, in the city, all the different things. So what is your take on the state of Mexican literature from your point of view, and that the narrative of Mexico, the contemporary Mexico we live?
Well, as you were saying, I mean, there's a huge variety of writers. There are many tendencies. There are people writing historical novels, science fiction, Tex-Mex novels, writing in Spanglish, or addressing the issues of the Mexican original communities, the Indian communities. In Mexico, there are more than 60 Indian languages that are being spoken. None of them is an official language, but nonetheless, there are writers writing in these languages or trying to convey the vision of these communities into Spanish. So it's a very, very interesting mixture of themes, tendencies, and strategies. I think
connected with music also.
Connected with, exactly,
with
performing.
film,
Yes, performing
right.
arts. That's very true.
Yeah.
So we have this crossovers, and I think your presence here belongs to that as well. People that comes from visual arts and start to write fiction, and or that they belong to the spoken word stage in which music is involved. Either Mexican popular music or rock music or these fusions of world music. And I think it's a very, very lively country. I mean, there are a lot of things happening there. And if you go there, there are small publishing houses, new magazines, discussions all over the world. And so it's a very active country in this respect. And maybe this has to do with the contrast of violence. If you want to oppose to the situation you are receiving daily, you have to do something different.
And you will say, in relation with the Spanish-speaking world, that Mexico is the cultural center, maybe? I mean, I will say
we
so.
like to think that.
I will say so. No, I really think so. It's interesting that because the connection with the obviously border with the Americans, then the connection with Latin America, with Cuba, and then with Spain, but then you have this melting pot happening in Mexico, and I think it's very interesting. But let's say that we have 10 more minutes, and maybe the public wants to ask some questions.
Yes, of course.
To that?
Yes,
okay.
we'll be more than happy to answer any questions if there are
some
questions, to take questions from the floor. Yes.
Hi, I'm an American, by the way, and I didn't take offense to any of the things
No,
you said.
you don't have to. No, it's a great country.
I was just wondering why you think the violence has increased in the last 20 or 30 years in Mexico, if there's a specific reason or if there's just a whole host of reasons.
It has increased or has been the same?
No, it has. I think it has increased the violent killings and so on. Well, I think it has to do with a lot of things. First of all, Colombia used to be the stronghold of drugs in Latin America. It ceased to be the stronghold, and Mexico became the second choice for being the stronghold of drugs. On the other hand, there has been a very, very bad strategy from the government to fight this problem, because this is a social problem. If you are a poor guy and you live in the outskirts of society, and the only chance that you have to have a better way of living is to become somebody who works for the drug dealers, it's only natural that this is going to be your first choice if you don't have cultural, political, religious, or other alternatives. So that became especially difficult when Felipe Calderón was president from 2006 to 2012. And those 6 years were terrible because he tried to understood this as only as a military problem. So he took out the army all over the country, and he expanded the problem. It's like trying to find out if there is dynamite in a room and to put on a match to see if there's dynamite. And you find out in a very wrong way that it actually there's a dynamite. So that was a very big problem. And there's a lack of understanding of this problem as a social problem, and it's our problem. It's not only that the United States are consuming the drugs, it's that we have a society in which the better chance for a young man is to become a drug dealer. At the moment, we have 7.5 million of people who are called the ninis, because they are called that ni estudian, ni trabajan. So they don't work, they don't study. So these young guys are 7.5 million, and they don't have social choices. So the best way for them to find out a living is to become illegal and to work for the drug dealers.
Because also we have had a terrible problem with the education system in Mexico. It has been deteriorating, and it was not so bad. The modernity 50 years ago was not so bad. It was free and was a good system of education, and today is totally devastated.
And the expansion of population as well, because we have
for
110 million inhabitants now. So that's another problem. So it's a very slow deterioration. We have an extremely corrupt government, because you can only have this spectacular amount of drug dealing in Mexico if the government is colluded with the drug dealers. So the army, the policeman, everybody is involved in the problem. So
and not precisely for regularizing or legalizing drugs, which could be maybe an interesting option at some point to think about the legalization of drugs or regularization of drugs, whatever you want to call it, to just absorb the kind of handle the industry, because it's such an industry, such a flow of money that is.
Yeah. Yes, I agree with Juan and Gabriel. I think it's necessary to Mexico to rethink the model of development, for example. Rethink the way to treat with society, I mean the political institutions. It's necessary for Mexico to put the young people in a way with certain ends. I mean, it's necessary to rethink all the situation in Mexico. And this is a responsibility of government and society at the same time.
Wow.
A lot of questions.
Yeah. You choose one.
No, the young man there.
The mustache.
The beard solidarity.
The beer solidarity.
Thank you. So it's interesting that you mentioned translation and crossings with the United States. And the United States is now the second country with the biggest population of Spanish speakers.
That's right.
And you mentioned Tex-Mex novels, and most of this Spanish-speaking population is Mexican or has come from Mexico. So do you think with this population, sometimes the second generations are losing the Spanish or is not being preserved? But at the same time, when Gabriel García Márquez died, for example, most of his writings were bought by the University of Texas in Austin. So all this knowledge, all these writings are moving around through the border as people are also moving and the language is moving. So I would like to ask you, what do you think could be the future of this? Do you think people are going to become more aware of the relationship between both countries? Do you think literature is going to just flow as people flow?
Well, things have been changing in a very interesting way in the States. For example, the most popular name in California is Jose, which is a Spanish name, and that's due to the Mexican influence. There are many rich people who have Mexican workers working for them and taking care of their children. So the children are learning a lot about the Holy Virgin of Guadalupe, about Mexican food, and so on. So on Super Bowl Sunday, the most eaten snack and last Super Bowl was guacamole. And that was above French fries with Tabasco sauce. Yes. So things are slowly changing as a habit. I have been teaching in different universities in the United States, and I have found out that there are second generation or third generation Chicanos who are very proud of their roots. And that's new, because for many of them, learning English was a way of having a better life. It was an upgrade in education and in social opportunities. And they tried to forget a little bit of Spanish, but this is changing. Spanish is an official language, and it's our responsibility as well in Mexico to try to address all the Mexicans that are living outside our borders, because Mexican government has tended to forget these Mexicans. They don't have, for example, the right to vote. It's impossible to, and there are some more than 10 million Mexicans living in the United States. So this can make a huge difference for voting in Mexico, but the government is aware of this, because if the people fled the country, it's because they don't have enough opportunities in the country. So this vote can be a critical vote. So they refuse to give rights of the people who live abroad to vote in national elections. But hopefully this can change in the future. And I think we have to do more to close the breaches between the Mexicans who live abroad and the Mexicans from the inside, because for many of us, this has been forgotten, and some of them, they cherish our values in an extraordinary way. For example, I remember the rock group Los Lobos. When you remember when Bob Dylan came for the first time in Mexico, the opening act was Los Lobos. And they came from California to Mexico. And the first day, there was this auditorium, and these were all, like, let's say, groovy Mexicans waiting for the prophet, waiting for Bob Dylan. And suddenly, the Lobos came to the stage, and the first thing they said was, long live the Holy Virgin of Guadalupe. And for them, the Holy Virgin of Guadalupe was a symbol of resistance, of resilience, because they lived abroad, and the Holy Virgin of Guadalupe is a national symbol of their identity. But for us, it was the Catholic traditional symbol, and it was so we had this confusion. And so it would be interesting to discuss more and to understand how some of the symbols that we think are old age symbols and that they belong to the past, or are even reactionary symbols, they travel as radical symbols all across the border. That's very interesting.
Yeah. I agree. I just want to Juana to participate in this moment. Yo quiero decir que la mentalidad de los mexicanos ha cambiado tanto como su cartografía, la cartografía del país.
So Mexicans' mentality has changed as much as the cartography of the country has changed.
Esto es no solamente por los cambios tecnológicos, sino porque el mundo está cambiando tan rápidamente que las culturas van entrelazándose.
This is not only due to technological changes, but also because of how in current times cultures are starting to mix.
Los símbolos como la Virgen de Guadalupe que comentaba Juan,
symbols such as the Virgin of Guadalupe that Juan was commenting,
se mantienen, pero a la vez se están transformando con la gente joven, con la gente nueva.
Are maintained, but at the same time they are transformed by young people.
Y todo esto va creando también unas nuevas formas de cultura.
And this, at the same time, creates new forms of culture.
Que implican desde luego a los jóvenes artistas, pero también de muchas otras edades.
Which implies young artists, but also of many other ages.
Por eso se habla que México ahora vive una suerte de cambio de mentalidad de la tradicionalidad mexicana a lo post-mexicano.
This is why we speak about Mexicans changing their mindset from traditional Mexican to the post-Mexican.
Yo creo que pertenezco un poco a la tradición porque creo en la Virgen de Guadalupe.
I think I belong a bit to tradition because I believe in the Virgin of Guadalupe.
But and we mentioned this also. We were thinking and we were saying something about the post-national, post-institutional, post-Mexican. So there are all these. We are walking in these ruins.
Yes, that's right.
And we are trying to create from them. I think we have time for one more. Yeah, my God. One here, sir.
The mic is on the way.
Mike, sorry. Really interesting discussion, thank you. I'm just wondering where you've talked so much about, almost obsessively, about the relationship with the United States, and I'm just wondering whether that has an impact on how Mexico itself develops with its other. It looks over the Pacific as well. It looks east. It looks south. And I just wonder whether the obsession with the relationship, good and bad, with the United States actually hinders your repositioning in the world and your development, both in terms of culture and in terms of political and social development.
It's very true what you say. When we say in Mexico, la frontera, the border, it means the border with the United States. And we share the border with Guatemala, Belize, in the south,
yes.
But we are not aware of that. And
well, we are, but
well,
I mean,
but not that much.
There is people coming from that border.
They come
there,
and we treat them very bad. No?
Right.
And in Central America, Mexico is regarded in a very bad way because we are obsessed, as you say, with the United States that belongs to the Mexican tradition, and we have this complex of the young brother because we want to have the love of the big brother. We want to have, we know that maybe the big brother is tough and he's unfair, but maybe he will give us some money and he will protect us. And that's an obsession that's hindering other contexts.
I don't think the right word is obsession. I think that it's just that it's a reality of everyday life. And we used to be connected with France before the revolution. I mean, Mexico was influenced by France, as the world was. And at the end of the 19th century, and then the revolution came, and the revolution was influenced by revolutions. There were revolutions at the beginning of the 20th century. And then the war came, and the Americans became so influential, whatever. I mean, very short story making schematically. But I think the connection with Mexico with Cuba has been very important 30 years ago. The connection with what we called the Latin American dream at some point, but was crushed by coup d'etat in the whole Latin America. All these things in Argentina, Chile, where all these people were coming to Mexico to live after all the dramas they were facing in Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay. They came to Mexico, and they became part of our culture.
With Spain as well,
and during the Civil War. So we have also receiving immigration from the American influence that is coming there. Mm-hmm. And then obviously we have a big border there. And they are also obsessed with that border. I mean, the Americans are obsessed with that border. I mean, I know there is a Donald Trump talking about it. So it's just a relation that is very close, and at the end it's a continent, right? And yes, but we have a good relationship with Japan. I mean, now I live in Tokyo, and it's quite amazing how has been communication there. But, so, yeah. I think, I don't know, we have time, Nick? One more?
Only
one more.
Question?
You.
All at the same time.
Los movimientos como el Yo Soy 132 y la búsqueda de los 43 desaparecidos, ¿por qué se han callado? ¿Por qué piensan que se han callado y reaparecerán cuando se logre lo de post-mexicano?
So movements such as Yo Soy 132 and the disappearance of the 43 students have been silenced, and why has this happened?
Well, there are two very different issues. Yo Soy 132, that was a students' movement, and it has to do with the formal elections 2 years ago. So they were protesting for the returning of the PRI. The PRI governed Mexico for 71 years on the road. 71 years governed Mexico. Then there was a gap of 12 years. And the PRI came back. So this anti-hero of politics, the people had nostalgia of this because they thought we were not very good with the PRI, but at least there was more order. The new government, it was a right-wing government, was as corrupt as the PRI, but they were inefficient in all aspects. So the people preferred to go back to the PRI, and they were fighting against it. But that was a conjuncture, and the people who were involved with this movement are involved in many other things right now. And I don't think that the 43 disappeared students from Ayotzinapa have been forgotten, and there is going to be the first anniversary on the 26th of September, and there are going to be demonstrations all over the country. And I went to Ayotzinapa because I am one of there's a Mexican tradition that the professors from different universities or from different parts of the country can be the best men for the people who have their graduation. So the people who belong, the students who belong to this generation, in which they are 43 missing students, they asked some 6 different people from the cultural field to go there as their best men. So we went to Ayotzinapa. It was a very, very moving and important demonstration because there was sadness there, but there was hope and there was fight. And I think that this hasn't gone into silence. Maybe some of the media, they are not covering it as it used to be covered, but I think that's a landmark in our history, and I think things are going to change in our country in certain aspects because of the disappearance of these 43 students.
Well, take care of your lives, you two guys. Keep the good work.
Thank you so much.
We will read you in English very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Very good.
Fantastic. Well
Thank you.
done.
Please wait.
I know we're running right up to time. I just want to briefly conclude by saying that I don't know about you, but I found that not only informative, but also I think, honestly, important. These are people who are willing to risk their lives by writing down words and to try to reveal something about what's happening in their country. But what I felt most of all as a spirit of optimism, that literature can flourish in a spirit of defiance. And that's important. So thank you.
Thank you.
The journalist is already working.
I'm in trouble now too. If you'd like to carry on talking to these wonderful writers, and not much of their work is published in English yet, but this book is, come and have it signed, come and talk to them in the bookshop, the adult bookshop across the way, and we'll carry on this wonderful conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.